Okay, everybody, welcome to this book launch for Betty Bendell, My Life and I, magazine columns written by Betty Bendell in the 1960s and the 1970s, and now republished today by Handheld Press. My name is Kate Macdonald. I am the director of Handheld Press, and I also wrote the introduction for this book because it is all my own idea to bring them together. I'm going to hand over now to Sarah LeFanu, who is going to basically interview me.
Hi, Kate. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So I thought we might start off actually just by talking about the extraordinarily vivid picture that these collected pieces give us of the late 60s and the early 70s in what you might loosely describe as Middle England, this country then. I was just kind of amazed at the the memories that are brought back, I suppose, of things like, of orange carpets, of self-service shops that weren't really supermarkets then. In one of the early pieces here, she compares the supermarkets in Canada, these enormous, glittering, multifunctional buildings with with the tiny little 2-aisle shops where the shopkeepers stand around looking incredibly nervous. And it's just a really funny contrast and reminds one so much of what it was like in 1967 and 1968 when you went and did your shopping. So I think, could we start off by talking perhaps about about how she brings that back for us and how important that is, actually.
It's interesting because I was little. I was too little to remember much about shopping. So, and I'm 58. And I do remember a grocer's shop, a traditional grocer shop that you went into. But I don't remember supermarkets before supermarkets. I just remember regular fine fare or co-op supermarkets. So for me, the memories are, I think, more about colors. You're absolutely right about orange carpets. And the cover image that we used, and I'm going to hold it up again. And actually, when we get the video edited, we'll get a big picture of the book. This is by Belinda Lyon, and she was a pretty well-known illustrator of the period. And when I was going through the scans of all the articles that Rick and Anna sent me from Betty's archive, Belinda Lyon's artwork just kept coming up. So she was used certainly by Family Circle magazine, and also by Good Housekeeping magazine in the late 60s and the early 70s to illustrate Betty, and obviously to illustrate many other things. But that style, for me, brings back comics of the time and the Girl Guide handbook and adverts of the period. So it spoke to me absolutely very, very powerfully. And I thought, we have to have this image. Trouble is, everybody had forgotten about Belinda Lyon. I mean, I could get the image scanned. So we had a digital copy, and our designer Nadja touched it up here and there where the scan had gone a bit wonky. So we had a very good high resolution image to use. But I had to get the permission to use it. And it took forever to try and track down Belinda Lyon's estate. I wasn't even sure she was alive. And it was only through somebody on Instagram who uses her own Instagram handle, which I've forgotten. She messaged me saying, "Oh, you got Belinda Lyon's artwork. We've done some research on her." So this woman and her sister had done 10 years earlier some intensive research to track down Belinda Lyon. So they were able to give me the agent's address. And during that process, I realized that Belinda had died, I think, in 2019. And I was also contacted by Oxfam about 2 months ago because they want to relicense some of the artwork that Belinda had done for them back in the 70s. So we could be seeing more of Belinda, which I'm so pleased about, because it was only because of the cover of our book that people started, saying, well, actually, yes, who is this woman?
Well, what a shame that she died in 2019 and wasn't around to see the publication of this book, because it is terrific. I mean, the flared trousers, the bright primary colours, the hair.
And the little smock, the little pink smock and smocking. Gosh, I remember smocking.
Yeah, me too. So let's talk about kind of the collection and how that kind of came about. So the Good Housekeeping columns were always entitled My Life and I. So those were the columns that Betty wrote.
That's correct, yeah.
I think My Life and I is a really interesting title, actually, because
Mm,
there's something a little bit self-satirical about it. There's something which is kind of perhaps archly grandiose. My life and I,
yeah.
and it's her life as a housewife, basically. So
Hmm.
what I want to ask you, Kate, is the subtitle, Confessions of an Unliberated Housewife. Now, where did that come from?
I think, and Anna may have to correct me on this, that was the subtitle of the book of some collected essays, magazine columns, that Betty brought out with a publisher in the 1976, I think, 77, or possibly the early 80s. And that's how I realized, that's almost how Betty jogged my memory, because I came across this book in a secondhand bookshop. It's not a very good collection of essays. It's not particularly funny. I don't know how they chose them, but the title, Confessions of an Unliberated Housewife, was, I thought, really good. So I pinched it.
It's a very interesting title, I think, because you aren't quite sure whether it's being used defiantly or whether it's being used in a self-deprecating way.
Absolutely, yeah.
Actually, I think that it rather captures the tone of a lot of these columns, which are kind of can be read in both those ways, as defiant and as self-deprecating.
Mm. And
Um,
she's not she's not liberated in the sense she's not buying into second wave feminism at
okay,
all.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, because it seems to me reading these, I mean, we all know, don't we, that the 1950s, in fact, carried on until the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
and that the 1960s carried on quite a lot into the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, as you say in your introduction, there is actually kind of no mention of feminism in these articles at all.
Yeah.
And it seems to me really as if as if as if there was no language that Betty could use in
Mm-hmm.
order to describe some of the, all the kind of, the personal experiences that she's writing about. Now, there was a language out there, but it was being forged at the time. So
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't being forged, as it were, kind of around where she was.
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps it was a language that was being forged that Good Housekeeping and Family Circle and Woman and the other magazines that she wrote for were not yet ready to have deployed on their pages.
I think the
What's
latter.
your take on that?
Yeah, I think the latter, but also I think she grew up, well, she was an adult in, just after the war. So the language she grew up learning, I think she was 40s going at 1940s, moving into the 1950s. Those were her formative years. There was no language then for the things she was describing in the 60s. I do remember reading from one of the clippings about her that Rick and Anna sent me that she was absolutely not a feminist. Anna, could you come back on this? Do you remember that?
Yes, she certainly didn't have an axe to grind, or she never was into women's lib and stuff, but she was definitely decades ahead of her time. I mean, I was one of the only children that had a mother that worked, and she often worked two jobs because she worked outside the home, plus she was writing like crazy all the time.
Mm,
And it was just normal for me to have a mother that worked, but very few of my friends' mothers worked. And yeah, she was a very intelligent person that was certainly decades ahead of her time.
yeah, that is interesting. So,
I don't think there's no doubt that she was a very intelligent person. I mean, that
yeah,
kind of shines through in her prose. But yes, and of course, I mean, although the majority, most of the content of these columns is about domestic work, every so often she reminds us that she's a writer. And as
yes.
we know, she was actually a very successful writer.
Mm,
Her columns as you say in the introduction, her columns syndicated around the world. So there's that kind of contradiction as well, that she's writing about being a woman who works but not for pay.
mm.
Actually, she is being, she's a successful magazine writer. She has a career there.
I wonder if the fact that she was eventually syndicated so widely is why she shied away or deliberately did not mention this topics that might be too contentious. And it's possible that feminism might not have been palatable to some of her markets, say in, I don't know, I'm assuming Australia, possibly South Africa, certainly the white Anglophone readership. In more conservative societies, it's possible they wouldn't have wanted to buy her column. So
I don't think she was particularly interested in feminism. Like she managed to, she always did what she wanted to do, whether she came up against a man or a woman or anybody. She didn't let men boss her around at all. And I don't think it ever occurred to her that she should be in a position of the little woman in life. She just did what she wanted to do. And she certainly wasn't a big, women's liber or anything. Just like with politics and things, she just assumed everybody had their political bent, and she was happy to let them have their opinions. And if they didn't agree with her, they weren't right.
Yeah, it's possible that we are applying today's expectations back on the past.
Yes, to a certain extent. Except that, I don't know, while I was reading them, I was just reminded of this, I suppose you could say, a slogan that I remember from a poster in the early 1970s, which went something like, you start by sinking into his arms.
I remember this one.
Your arms in his sink, and it was rather beautifully illustrated. And actually, I mean, I take your point completely, Anna, that your mother was not, wouldn't have called herself a lib or anything. But actually, she does write about that rather a lot. I mean,
She does.
all the time, thinking about things while she's doing the washing up. She talks quite a lot about that washing up bowl and her hands being in it, and how she wants to get a different coloured washing up bowl and things like that. And she also talks quite a lot, writes quite a lot about not exactly about sinking into his arms, but about her pre-marriage days or her courting days, and the glamour and the fun. And I think that that's rather kind of well represented by that slogan, which actually was a feminist slogan.
Yeah, I think she was living a life that many women now would think, well, that is feminist because of all your actions. But yes, naming it and the vocabulary is completely missing. Again, as Anna said, it wasn't something that she considered. It there was no ideology to dwell on. She just got on and lived the way she wanted to.
Well, let's can I ask you now about the actual writing style? I mean, in your introduction, you write about what a great comic writer she is, and you highlight some of the ways in which she does that. So perhaps would you tell us about her skill at writing comedy?
I think it's probably down to, and Anna will tell me, that she may well have been an extremely good teller of stories to make people laugh in real life, like the entertainer of the family, someone who would be the life and soul of the party, because she would be able to hold people's attention by telling something that she knew would make them laugh. And she has somehow transferred this skill onto paper. So she's got terrific grasp of when a tonal change. So when the mood changes, the tone changes. And when you do that, when you move from high to low, that's called bathos in the poetry analysis section of this lecture. And it's very easy to do. We all do it because I think most of us have been brought up with the influence of Monty Python, and Monty Python are the modern experts at bathos. When, I don't know, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where you get Brian's mother saying, he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. So you start high with the concept of the Messiah, and then you lurch down to a mother telling off her boy in public. So Betty used bathos impeccably. She was also very good at balancing not so much the euphony, the way the words sound, and she was very keen on using the right vocabulary and exploring language, but also the rhythms of speech. She would make a sentence last for a whole paragraph because the longer you leave it, it can build up steam and become funnier under the weight of its own exuberance. And sometimes she would just stop you short with a single line as a single paragraph, which would go, oh, okay, that's really good, that's funny, that's effective. And she was also so good at applying inappropriate or tonally incorrect words to subjects. So, for example, the example I give is she's describing her 18-month-old son as gazing leerily from his cot and yelling drunkenly. And you don't apply words to do with alcoholic consumption to an 18-month-old baby. So that mad juxtaposition produces humor on its own. And then you get the picture of a red-faced toddler gambling around and just falling about with sheer exuberance and fun and having a lovely time. And that in itself is endearing and funny and just an affectionate way of doing things. So it's a combination of word use, a very clever use of word use, but I think it's very instinctive. And this goes back to my original point. Anna, was she a party animal in the sense of telling great stories and keeping the dining table enthralled in that way?
Well, probably Jill would be better to answer this. But yes, she was very, yes, she was the center of attention, not needing the attention, but just because she was so interesting that people would gravitate towards her and she would keep them entertained for hours at parties and things. Yes, you're right with her stories. And
that's so interesting because actually quite often the persona that she puts over is somebody who used to be the centre of attention at parties in her black tights and her sheath-like red dress. But now that she is a wife and mother, she is no longer the centre of attention. And in fact, it's her husband, David, with his moustache, who has and his pipe, who has the young women twining around him. And there's one marvelous piece. I can't remember which one it's in. Is it about the parties where she talks about? Hang on, let me just, because I marked one or two of these. It was, oh gosh, yes, it was. It was Party Time Is Here Again. She was obviously very keen on parties, and she talks about about how marvelous it was when you would go to a party and men would follow you around the room, breathing heavily. And now she says, but once we are married, we haven't time for all that heavy breathing, even supposing we do intercept the odd morale-boosting mating call. And I think that's a wonderful phrase as well, and very typical of her. The morale-boosting mating call is incredibly funny, I
Yeah,
think.
she valorizes flirtation. She's absolutely delighted in the idea of being admired by another man. It really perks her up. And it's true, to be admired, everybody likes to be admired, but she was unusual, I think, in writing about it with such glee. There was no simpering, no boast, no bashful, oh goodness me, that can't possibly be meant for me. It's just, wow, he thinks I'm looking great. Isn't that wonderful? I feel great because of that. And that's unabashed. I really enjoy that about her writing and about the persona that she puts across in her writing.
I absolutely agree. And some of those pieces are extremely funny. Now, I would also say, though, that I think that she expresses an anxiety that I think, probably speaks to, many women who are, what should we say, approaching middle age, women who've been married for 9-10 years, who've got young children, an anxiety about that loss of attractiveness. That was something that she was, as it were, kind of putting on for the readers, or not, I don't know. I mean, I do think the whole business of her writing persona is quite an interesting one. But it seems to me that's something, well, it's just something that kind of struck me a bit, that I felt that there was a sadness or a regret in the in the persona or in the writing. I don't know whether you agree with that.
I do see what you mean. I suspect it's a very relatable thing to write about. And she knew she was writing for a largely female audience of a certain age, if not younger, and certainly in the thrall of domestic tyranny. So to be able to share a sense of regret that I can no longer fit in this dress and I have to give it to my daughter because she can use it for her dressing up box because I can't get into it anymore. I thought lovely. We've all done that, I think. But also, she's like she talks about a friend coming. She meets a friend who's looking absolutely amazing because the friend's had a makeover, and then someone comes around with a box full of makeup, and they spend a happy 2 or 3 hours patting each other's hands and faces with potions and chemicals and cosmetics. That's for a magazine that gets an awful lot of its advertising from makeup companies. It's absolutely appropriate for not just for her readers, but for her market. And she's very careful to not name any names. I really don't think she names a single brand name, which may have been part of the editing. I don't know. But it's extremely clever. So you get this generic sense of, oh, makeup is wonderful, it will all make you feel good. And people then rush out and buy makeup to make themselves feel good. And it doesn't matter which brand. That's, yeah.
I think it is very clever. And I mean, I probably wouldn't have noticed it had you not pointed it out in the introduction that that actually is what she does. But I'm sure that you're right. I mean, that something like Good Housekeeping, you know, was very reliant on its advertising and would have to be terribly careful not to mention one brand over another. There's another point you make, which I think is very interesting, which is that, I mean, she was obviously an extremely literate woman, and I would say, I mean, you can tell us, Anna, a cultured woman too. But I wonder whether she makes, I think you suggest this, that possibly she makes herself out to be less cultured than she actually is. She doesn't mention very many books.
No.
Although she does, there's a marvelous description of an elderly woman in a laundrette who looks like a gnarled tree as drawn by Arthur Rackham. I think that is brilliant. Just kind of see the woman there. She's fighting with her over the laundry for money, something, I don't quite know what. But she doesn't actually mention very many books. I mean, okay, she doesn't mention brands because she probably isn't allowed to, but she doesn't mention many
I think
books.
she mentions Iris Murdoch at least twice.
Okay.
And the night that Anna and Rick got engaged, she was in bed reading The Lord of the Rings and was most annoyed that David came up and told her about it because she had to stop reading. But I think I think that is the only book title that she even mentions. Again, possibly because she's thinking of her readers, doesn't want to make out that she's more well-read than they are. So it's avoiding the specific to become more generally appealing. Anna, can you tell us, did she go to the theatre much, or what arts did she enjoy?
Just basically literature. She her father was a very literate person. In those days, in the 20s, he was ahead of his time, even though he was his job didn't involve education. But she learned to read at 4, and she just loved literature. And I think she realized that not many people shared her knowledge of literature, so she didn't want to ram it down people's throats. She was being polite, I think, by just, accepting that, some people wouldn't know what she would be talking about.
Yeah.
And presumably in those in the early years, I mean, when you and your brother were little, there really wasn't a great deal of time for reading.
No.
I mean, except late at night when you're falling asleep. Sort of imagine that might well have been the case. One of the other things that struck me, though, thinking about, the kind of the culture behind it all, is the way that, I mean, she gets a great deal out of comedy about her desires to make her home more colourful, about her aspirations towards kind of the new fabrics that are coming out, things like that. But I would say kind of particularly the colour, actually, and she writes quite a lot about material, about things for the kitchen, about the poppy red sheets that she suggests that she should buy. And I felt that there was a kind of possibly some kind of artist manqué there, or that she had a real kind of passion for art that, a bit like the books, didn't go into the columns.
She her first job was at Heels, learning interior decorating.
Wow.
And she followed that through her life, and the last couple of years of her life, she would often go on and on about interior decorating, and she would change even then the furniture around at least once a month. My poor dad would be dragging sofas and hutches and things around the apartment. She was always, yes, into interior decorating.
Well, that's so
That's
family.
lovely.
Was it heels? I mean,
Yes, yes.
puts her at the absolute kind of, I would say, at the absolute forefront, if not the cutting edge, of that
Right.
of the popular design movement that happened in this country in the 1960s, that took us out of the, you know, the dreary monotones of the, you know, of the immediate post-war period.
Mm,
It took us
yeah.
into color television, and, you know, and jazzy designs for our sitting rooms and our bedrooms.
Mm.
What kind of house did you live in, Anna, in the 70s? Do you remember?
Um, it was we had an old house in Goring, and
Hmm.
then in about 71 we moved to Henley in a nice new row house, and Jilly was our neighbor next door, and Paradise Road opposite George Harrison. Yeah, it was a modern house. She loved modern houses. Over here, she always had new houses, just
Yeah.
not just regular houses, but
Hmm.
she liked new.
You say that, you know, when you were young, when you were small, you actually, you know, looked forward to the copies of Good Housekeeping.
Yeah. I used to lie on the carpet
And
reading them.
you used to love these columns as
I
well.
loved them. Yeah, this was it. I, yes, from about the age of 7 or 8, yeah, I would lie on the living room carpet and just read it. Mum obviously had the magazine before me. Then it would be put on the coffee table or left on a sofa. And then we never had a sofa until after I'd left home. It must have been an armchair. And I would just lie full length on the carpet and read Betty Bendell and look at the cartoon that came with it and then read it again and go, oh, that was good. Then I would flick through the rest of the magazine. And I like the makeover pages with the look for a lifestyle. I don't know when it began, probably a bit later. But anything that gave you advice about how to be a proper woman, that was the kind of thing I liked, because it was just so peculiar that people would want to tell you how to do this thing.
Mhm.
Um,
And sort of grown up as well, I imagine.
a bit grown up, but also, oh, someone else is
You
just
grown
coming
up.
in. Yeah, although I was still at primary school, but I think it was, she made me laugh so much. That's why I enjoyed the columns. And I probably went and told Mum, oh, it was really good this month. She told you about this. And Mum would go, yes, dear, can you set the table for dinner? My mum doesn't really remember. She remembers Good Housekeeping with a passion and still buys it, but she doesn't really remember Betty Bendell at all. So I don't know. I'm sorry about her lack of taste, Anna, but there we go. At least she bought the magazine so I could enjoy Betty.
So I think it's quite an interesting thing, actually, publishing a book that is made up of pieces that were read serially, that were read just month by month. And what's the difference in the experience, I wonder? I mean, I didn't read them back in the day, so
Hmm.
I've only seen them kind of gathered between the covers of your book. The
Yeah.
lovely book. What's the difference, do you think?
Um, well, for a start, this book is not all the columns. I think I've used just under half of what Rick and Anna had collected or what Betty had collected in her own archive. And I only used the ones that made me laugh or that I thought were really, really good for social history because it gave you an insight into what it was like going to London to have your hair done in Carnaby Street or something like that, which is properly historic. But reading them serially, it was like being given a window, sort of opening the door into another family or a woman's life. And then it would close, and then you next time you'd read the next one, and they wouldn't necessarily be connected. But there might be a danger of reading them in a book, one after the other, that you begin to make connections where there aren't actually any. I've ordered them chronologically, and I didn't detect any retrofitting, where Betty in a later column said that she'd done something when earlier she hadn't. There are certainly a few occasions where she reused material across magazines, so I didn't do any of the duplication. But they're not really a serial, they're a series. So a serial is when you have things that are connected, episodes which have a connection, a beginning and an end that connect to each other naturally. But I think a series is just a collection which they don't have a natural innate connection with the text. That sounds terribly garbled? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I mean, I think what's interesting about them is that, is that the theme is constant. I mean, the theme is about what it's like to be a housewife and to do those things that in those days were expected of a housewife, involving your house primarily, I would say, and then slightly peripherally your husband, and slightly less peripherally your children, but actually the house is at the centre of it all. And I think that it's very clever the way that she draws so many different pictures, so many variations
Yeah.
on central theme.
But
And
you're right. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. It is all about the house,
is
or it's about how she lives. An awful lot of them are about clothes. I think I enjoyed them most. The dressmaking one is the one I remember best of all. And she makes.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
The dress is fascinating.
It's good. I mean, I grew up in a family where all the women sewed. So that was normal to me. But the thought of actually making a woolen coat was just terrifying. It was such an intimidating thing to do. And my grandmother she was a tailor. She trained in a tailor's establishment in London. So I knew coats could be made by human beings and not just come out of a shop, like out of an envelope. But my mother had never done that. But I was making peg doll dresses very early, and my mother was making a lot of my clothes and my sister's clothes, and her own. So sewing was normal. I knew my way around a sewing machine pretty early on in my life. But to read about Betty's catastrophic choice of a thing to sew and how beautifully she sewed it and all the effort she put into it, and then it was awful, that spoke to me very strongly, because I've done that. I've done complicated embroideries which ran out of space in the last inch because I hadn't sized it properly, and it's just this hideous despair. I could really, really empathize even at that young age.
Well, she taught crafts in the Wrens up in Scotland, in Arbroath, for a number of years, and she was amazing. She could do leather work, she could do pottery, anything she turned. She was so good at crafts. And sewing, I always remember I was the best dressed little girl at school because I would have she would make me beautiful dresses.
Oh,
and
lovely. Yeah.
yeah, it was quite something that I'd be very excited to see what she came up with each term. It was lovely. Yeah. She was an excellent sewer, and because she was so unmechanical, it was on the treadle sewing machine. And before that, she had the hand turner, and she made all our clothes on that.
That's amazing. I have used a hand treadled one, and I don't want to. I don't like them. Give me electricity anytime. It's just so impressive.
She doesn't, I mean, in the columns that are reproduced here in the book, she doesn't talk about pottery or the other crafts.
No, it's true.
You say it, Anna. I mean, it sort of doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think that the way that she writes about her sewing, sort of, in a way, I feel, that were it a few years later, that maybe she might have, maybe this is a bit fanciful of me, but what I would suggest is that she would see that kind of traditional woman's craft of sewing and of making, she would have valued it perhaps for something like an art form. I mean, which was what was happening in the 1970s. I mean, there were women artists who were kind of creating a language about, stitching, sewing, embroidery as art forms and not just kind of the making of things for the home. And I feel that, from the way that she writes about it, that she had a kind of passion for making things. So I suppose all I'm saying is that, that it's just kind of interesting to speculate, perhaps, about if there'd been other languages in which to kind of insert herself, how she would have. That is a bit fanciful, I agree. Okay.
It's a nice idea.
She was a craft worker. And I think that she was an artist as well. And you can see that in the writing, actually. I mean, basically, this is what it comes back to.
Right.
Skilled writer, just producing the correct number of words, the right shape of story to fit that word length.
Absolutely. It's always a surprise to me how she managed to return to the original point in such a small number of words, and she'd make so many jokes and give so much emotional impact. But the end, it's, you know, it's like an article in The Economist, is a style that economist writers have to use. Start with a single example, write your economic forecast article, and then come back to the single example and show how the economic point reflects on that. And Betty's doing exactly the same. So it may be just a basic journalistic technique that she'd been taught early on when she'd been writing for the local newspaper. I don't know. I've never studied journalism.
But something else we have to remember is that she had to write the articles 6 months ahead of time. So she'd be sitting there in the middle of July having to turn out a Christmas article, which made it even harder. And we talk about syndicated, but her articles weren't guaranteed to be accepted. She had many, many rejection letters, and she would have to send like 5 articles a month to Good Housekeeping, and they might only accept one.
Oh my goodness, I had
yes.
no idea.
So she was like, she works so hard. And I just remember that one, you know, looking up at her one summer's day, and she's there writing away about this darn Christmas.
Oh, that's amazing. I'd forgotten. Yes, of monthly magazines have long lead times. And yeah, of course you would have to write the articles seasons in advance. Oh, the poor woman.
Yes. I don't know how she did it.
You know, she was sending off, you know, 5 articles at once, and only one of them would be accepted or not. I mean, that seems to me awful.
So heartbreaking.
She wasn't as it were, a salaried columnist. She was a freelancer, liable to have her work rejected every time she sent something in.
Right.
That's quite precarious.
Yeah, her life was defined by rejection, basically.
Oh, and you'd never know that, but in what she wrote.
Yeah.
She managed to keep that pretty separate. Oh, wow.
I think that's why you see her appearing in so many different publications, because she would have this whole stack of articles, and it's okay, Good Housekeeping didn't accept it, so we'll try She, or we'll try Family Circle and see if it appeals to them.
Yeah.
So it was
and in fact, in your introduction, Kate, you do kind of mention a little bit about the different magazines, and that some were, I think you say that Family Circle, I think the word you use is racier than Good Housekeeping.
Yeah, I've applied the word racy to Family Circle because the only article from Family Circle I can remember was must have been 1973 or 74. And the article was about August is a wicked month. So it was the August issue. And it was 21 things to do in the house that will spice your life up. And one of them was do the housework naked. And I'd never forgot it because I grew up in Aberdeen, and the very thought of doing the housework naked in Aberdeen, even in August, I don't think so. And just the visual horror of it, watching all these magazine readers blithely doing the vacuuming with no clothes on. It's quite a memorable image, and I've never forgotten it. So because of that, and I never saw anything like that in Good Housekeeping, I think Family Circle had a broader appeal for, I don't know, people who wanted a little bit more from life, perhaps.
And I mean, when you consider that she was writing that article about doing the housework naked when it was January or February, according to Anna, it makes it more extraordinary, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think, no, Betty didn't write that article. Oh, well, actually, I don't know if Betty wrote that article or not. I've just never forgotten it. But it was a Family Circle article.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, my
that
mistake.
Labelled the magazine in my memory.
Right. She wrote for Woman as well, didn't she? And there's one or two women in here, and they're a bit different too from
yeah.
Which one it is actually? Did I mark it? I'm not sure that I
can't remember.
That I thought.
She magazine was much more high fashion than Good Housekeeping. But I don't recall which articles came from She. Yeah. But GH was her staple. And I expect they were quite grateful to her because she was just so popular and people loved her. And readers, I think, Rick, you filmed Betty in her later years, didn't you? And it's a wonderful video that you managed to get transferred onto a more modern medium so I could look at it. And Betty talks about how, now where was I? Yes, there would be surveys done by GH saying that, surveys of the readers, and the readers would routinely say Betty Bendell, her column was one of the best things in the magazine.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that was a very interesting interview around 1996, I think. So she would have been about my age. And I got to know her so well, and I knew she was just a fantastic writer. So I thought I'd better capture this while she's still alive and while we're all still around. And it was a great interview. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was very useful for me. And actually seeing what she was like, I got such a good impression of the kind of woman she was. I thought, okay, yeah, I know people like you. I can relate to things you're saying here and there. Yes, it was like eavesdropping in a cafe. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could I just read out a paragraph, which I think just so good and so kind of illustrative of the various things that we've been talking about. And it also, you feature in it a teeny bit, Anna, and also it reflects on marriage, and I think a kind of quite interesting way, really. And it's the one, it's called The Problems of Captivity. And it starts, I was wandering about with a jar of dead caterpillars when the thought struck me. Nature has arranged things admirably for butterflies. They start life in a limited way, very limited if they take part in one of my daughter's nature study projects. So that's why she's wandering around with a jar of dead caterpillars, which otherwise we don't know. And I think that's rather typical of the way that she kind of introduces subject, actually. Quite subtle. But if they survive the early stages, they at least end their lives in an intoxicating whirl of freedom. With us, it is different. We start adult life all free and fluttery, creep into the marital cocoon, and emerge to find that life has become a rather cabbagey affair.
Oh,
completely brilliant, actually.
It is, yeah. The imagery, the return to the beginning, yes.
And I think that it kind of, I can imagine how that speaks to, the whole swathe of the Good Housekeeping readers, who look back at their youth, which is not actually so very long ago. But it's not saying that everything is terrible, but she's just in a very comic way.
And it also doesn't say, and you must, of course, have children, because it makes the experience of having to hold caterpillars for your daughter's nature project really not what you might want to be doing, but you better get on and do it. So those people who haven't had children go, well, there, but for the grace of God, go I. That's useful.
Yeah.
I think now we should open up the conversation to questions. Has anybody got a question that they would like to ask any of us, really? If you do, please unmute yourself, wave your hand, use or type a question into the chat. I see we have one remark already from Barbara saying, I think Anna's mum had 3 jobs. She was also bringing up a family. I always said I didn't work outside the home, but I had plenty to do there and have no regrets. And I think Betty could well have agreed with you on that. So does anyone have any questions?
Maybe I'll just say a few things. So as was mentioned, Betty had an archive of all of the columns and articles she produced throughout the years, right? But as well, she kept a number of letters tucked away, fan mail, let's call it, that she received while writing for Good Housekeeping. All of the readers expressed their love for her columns, how relatable they were, and how much they had been moved by them. Several described instances where they had similar family mishaps. One letter mentioned how her daughter thought that Betty must be spying on the family because it so closely resembled her life. So I hope you don't mind if I share a few tidbits from some of the letters.
Please do, yeah.
Okay. One letter in particular was heartbreaking, actually, from a 19-year-old who'd had a terrible home life, suffering years of mental abuse from both her parents, who eventually divorced. She'd never shared her story to anyone before, but Betty's columns had moved her to write an anonymous letter to share her situation. In her closing words, she wrote, "Thank you for your article because it gave me thoughts and words to express them. So I would imagine that girl would now be close to 70 years old. So it'd be interesting to hear what how her life turned out. And as well, we talked earlier about the fact that Betty had not mentioned any brand names. But if you look at the article named Tights in the June 1970 edition of Good Housekeeping, Betty wrote a very funny column called Tights, in which she details her difficulties in finding a pair for what she calls her warrior maiden build. She mentions Wolford's number 4 tights as ones that seem to fit the bill most closely. Shortly after that June edition of Good Housekeeping was published, Betty received a letter from Wolseley Limited, indicating they had read her page with interest and amusement, commiserated with her, and asked if she would try a pair of the enclosed samples. So Betty did try them and responded in her own whimsical way. And I'll just read that. How very good of you to send 2 pairs of tights for me to try after reading My Life and I in the June edition of Good Housekeeping. I did try them. Gently, I rolled them into position. Waist elastic reached to my waist. Toes still had room to flex. Gingerly, I stalked up and down the living room, then a tentative knees bent, everything still in position. Emboldened, I did 1 or 2 high kicks. Family drew curtains to disperse gathering crowds. A couple of quick arabesques, a magnificent entrechat, fouette into the fireplace, and everything still holding together. Verdict, fit for a warrior maiden. So she sent that to Wolseley in reply. So I'm sure they had a good laugh over that. So all that to say, Betty made a difference in people's lives over the years, bringing smiles to their faces and allowing them to see how her life unfolded and the similarities within their own lives. So I think we've got quite a few letters, and all of them speak to that common theme that it was the first thing that they looked for when the Good Housekeeping magazine arrived.
I think that's just gorgeous. I'm so pleased that you found the letters. I'm delighted. I had no idea that they were there.
Yeah, they're here.
Oh, it's lovely. Are there any questions? People are very quiet and shy, not wishing to put themselves forward.
There weren't any questions. I just thought that we might mention before the end the 2 or 3 columns that she wrote about the fox cub, Chuckle, which I know that you particularly like, Kate, because you said that you found some of it very moving indeed.
Well, I did.
And I was very struck by the kind of the practicality of what she describes, the kind of how you Anna and the family asked for help and got help from your next door neighbor and actually looked after this fox cub, and how you then what happened when it grew up and went away. There was something kind of there was nothing really very comic about it. It was just very straightforward.
Yeah, it was moving. Anna, do you remember that incident with the fox?
Oh, yes, like it was yesterday. It's amazing. Yes, she was very practical, Mum, and if there was a problem, she would just go straight to the best way to solve it. And yeah, we were walking, I remember that, and this fox came up and literally landed on my foot, and she said, okay, we got to take it home and rescue it, look after it. And yeah, and Dad put a run on the back of the shed. And yeah, we used to go to the butcher's store and get chicken feet. He used to save them for us. We used to feed it. And it's true, the fox, we went on holiday and Chuckles left, but he came back a few weeks later just to visit once or twice. And it was just accepted that, yeah, he would live with us for a while and then move on.
It's the last image that Betty wrote in that article of you dancing in the dark with the fox, from the light from the dining room or the kitchen, because they'd woken you up to tell you that Chuckles had come back. Oh,
everything she wrote was true. It's everything happened. She didn't make up anything in those articles, and which is pretty amazing.
Oh, goodness. We have a question. Yeah, Rose says, where is the archive? I imagine it's in your cupboard somewhere, Rick.
Yes, it is. It's in a few bins actually at the moment, beside me, because I've had to reference it a bit. But yeah, it's here.
Okay.
Yeah,
in safe
she
hands.
was sorry, Kate. She was so organized, my mother. She was the most amazing administrative assistant when she had those jobs. She would organize every office. And after she died, we found all these notebooks that she had recorded every single article she had ever written. So we're going back to like 1962, where she sent it to be published, if it was accepted, what the publication was, how much money she got. And there's just books and books and books of them. She was just so organized. And notebooks on who she sent Christmas cards to and if she got one back. Holly, it's all recorded for us.
Oh my word, the Christmas card list of shame. Marvelous.
But years and years.
I have to say, the notebooks recording what she earned from her articles and where she sent it, that would be a really useful archive to donate to, I don't know, a college or a university that has creative writing courses, because it's evidence and it's also inspirational. Anyway, that's just a thought. I think now we should stop because we're running up to the end of our hour. Thank you all for coming. It's been lovely to see you and your little black boxes with your names. Thank you very much, Anna, and to Rick for taking part, and to Sarah for interviewing me, which is just so much easier than me interviewing myself, which is just not so much fun. Yeah, thank you all, and I'm going to turn the recording off now.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
That was
Thank
lovely.
You. Want to see more from us? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, or new content alert.